The rain came down like needles that November morning in 1842, each drop hitting the ground with a sound somewhere between a tap and a crack. It wasn't the kind of rain that soaked through your wool coat and chilled your bones. No, this was something else entirely. This was the kind of rain that turned the world to glass before your eyes, coating every branch, every blade of grass, every exposed surface with a shell of ice so clear you could see right through it to the thing beneath. And when that rain touched metal, when it found the lock of a flintlock rifle or the hammer of a percussion cap gun, it did something far worse than just freeze. It sealed, it locked, it rendered useless the very tools a man needed to survive. Jacob Hartley stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the freezing rain transform the forest around him into something beautiful and deadly. He was 37 years old that year, a man who'd spent the better part of 2 decades in the high country of the Montana Territory, in that wild stretch of mountains where the Bitterroot Range met the Continental Divide. He'd come west from Pennsylvania in 1825, barely 20 years old, carrying his father's rifle and a head full of ideas about what the frontier would be. 20 years had taught him that most of those ideas were wrong, but they'd also taught him how to read the land, how to think like the animals he hunted, and how to see problems before they killed you. The clearing before him was one he knew well. It sat in a bowl between 2 ridges, and every autumn the elk moved through it on their way down from the summer range. By November, they'd be thick here, and a man with a good rifle and a steady hand could put up enough meat to see his family through the worst of the winter. But today, Jacob wasn't thinking about elk. He was thinking about the rifle across his back, and about the 7 other hunters camped 2 miles down the valley, and about the bet he'd made 3 nights ago around a fire that smelled of pine pitch and whiskey. The rifle on his back was a strange thing. Even Jacob would admit that. It was built from what the other hunters had called junk metal, a patchwork of different alloys and materials that he'd spent the better part of a year assembling and testing. The barrel was made from an iron-nickel blend he'd salvaged from a meteorite he'd found half buried in a creek bed. The lock mechanism combined brass, steel, and something the old French trapper Pierre Leblanc had called Indian silver, though it wasn't silver at all, but rather a copper-zinc alloy that the Nez Perce Smiths had been using for generations. The stock was hickory, but reinforced with strips of thin bronze he'd hammered flat and inlaid into the wood. To anyone who knew rifles, who knew the carefully matched components and precisely fitted parts that defined a quality firearm, Jacob's creation looked like exactly what Thomas Brennan had called it: a piece of mongrel trash that'd blow up in your face the first time you pulled the trigger. But here was the thing about Jacob Hartley. He hadn't built this rifle on a whim, and he hadn't cobbled it together from scraps because he couldn't afford better materials. He'd built it this way because he'd spent 20 years watching good rifles fail, and he'd started to understand something that the gunsmiths back east, the ones who built beautiful matching guns with perfectly uniform metals, had never needed to learn. He'd started to understand that different conditions demanded different solutions, and that sometimes the right way to build something was the way that worked, not the way it had always been done. The camp 2 miles down the valley held 7 hunters, and every one of them carried what they considered a proper rifle. Thomas Brennan had a Pennsylvania long rifle, .50 caliber, built by a master gunsmith in Lancaster. The barrel alone had cost him $40, and he treated that gun like some men treated their horses or their wives or their Bibles. Samuel Worth carried a percussion cap rifle he'd bought in St. Louis, one of the new models that everyone said was the future of firearms. John and William Muller, brothers from Ohio, each had identical flintlocks their father had built, solid and reliable, and nearly impossible to tell apart. Marcus Wright, David Campbell, and young Peter Holland rounded out the group, each with their own carefully maintained, properly built, conventional rifles. And every single one of those rifles, Jacob knew, was going to fail today. The problem wasn't the rifles themselves. In normal conditions, in the kind of weather a man could reasonably expect, those were fine weapons, better than fine. Thomas Brennan's Pennsylvania long rifle was accurate to 300 yards in the right hands, and Thomas had the right hands. Samuel Worth's percussion cap gun could fire twice as fast as any flintlock, and the caps were more reliable than loose powder and a flint strike. The Muller brothers' rifles were built so well they'd probably still be firing 100 years from now. But this wasn't normal weather. This wasn't the kind of cold a man could prepare for with extra oil and a good cloth. This was freezing rain, and freezing rain did things to a rifle that no amount of careful maintenance could prevent. Jacob had seen it happen before. 3 years ago, November of 1839, he'd been hunting with a group of trappers up near the headwaters of the Clearwater River. The weather had turned just like this. Temperature hovering right around 32 degrees, rain coming down steady and freezing on contact. They'd been tracking a grizzly that had torn apart their cache, and when they'd finally cornered the beast in a box canyon, 5 rifles had failed to fire. 5 rifles, all well-maintained, all properly loaded, all carried by men who knew what they were doing. The rain had gotten into the mechanisms. It had frozen the pans shut on the flintlocks, sealed the nipples on the percussion caps, coated the hammers and locks with ice, so that when a man pulled the trigger, nothing happened except a dull click and a rush of cold fear as the grizzly charged. One man had died that day, another lost his arm, and Jacob had stood there, his own rifle frozen useless in his hands, and watched it happen and been able to do nothing. That was when he'd started thinking differently about rifles. That was when he'd stopped accepting the conventional wisdom that a gun should be built one way, the right way, with matched metals and uniform construction. That was when he'd started asking himself what a rifle really needed to do and how different materials responded to different conditions, and whether there might be a better way. The other hunters didn't understand this. To them, a rifle was a finished thing, a tool you bought or inherited or commissioned from a smith who knew the traditional methods. You maintained it, you cleaned it, you treated it well, and it served you faithfully. The idea that you might build a rifle from mismatched metals, that you might combine materials in ways that no proper gunsmith would ever approve, struck them as not just unorthodox, but actively foolish, dangerous even. 3 nights ago, around that fire 2 miles down the valley, after they'd all eaten and the whiskey was making its rounds, Thomas Brennan had asked Jacob about his rifle, not in a friendly way, in the way you might ask a man about a suspicious horse or a claim that seemed too good to be true. "That the gun you've been working on?" Thomas had said, nodding at where Jacob's rifle leaned against a tree. "The one with all the different metals?" Jacob had nodded, not rising to the bait. "That's the one. Mind if I take a look?" Jacob had handed it over, and Thomas had examined it in the firelight, turning it this way and that, running his fingers over the barrel, the lock, the stock. The other hunters had gathered around, and Jacob had watched their faces, seen the skepticism, the barely concealed amusement. "This is meteorite iron?" Thomas had asked, tapping the barrel. "Part of it, mixed with terrestrial iron and a bit of nickel." "And this lock?" Samuel Worth had leaned in, squinting at the mechanism. "That's not steel. That's brass and copper, and I don't even know what else. Copper-zinc alloy, and some steel, yes, and brass for the pan." "Why?" This from Marcus Wright, genuinely confused. "Why would you mix metals like that? Any smith would tell you that's asking for trouble. Different metals expand and contract at different rates. They respond differently to cold, to moisture. You need uniformity in a rifle, not this jumble." Jacob had taken his rifle back, cradled it gently. "I built it this way because I've watched uniform rifles fail. I've seen what happens when everything's made the same way, responds the same way to the same conditions. Sometimes different is stronger. Different is weaker," Thomas had said flatly. "A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. You've got a dozen different materials in that gun, which means you've got a dozen different weak points. Or a dozen different strengths," Jacob had replied quietly, "each material doing what it does best." Young Peter Holland, who at 19 was the youngest of the group, had laughed then, not cruelly, but with the kind of dismissive humor that stung worse than outright mockery. "Junk metal," he'd said. That's what my pa would call that gun, a junk metal special. Probably blow your hand off the first time you fire it in real weather." The others had chuckled, and the conversation had moved on, but later that night, after most of the camp had turned in, Thomas Brennan had approached Jacob again. This time his tone was more serious, less mocking, but no less skeptical. "Look, Jacob," he'd said, "I know you've been out here a long time. I respect that. But this gun of yours, it's not just unorthodox, it's dangerous. You're betting your life on a theory, on an idea that goes against everything every gunsmith has learned over the past 200 years. You really think you know better than all of them?" "I think I know different than them," Jacob had said. "I think I've seen conditions they never had to deal with, and I think sometimes the old ways work until they don't, and then you need new ways." Thomas had shaken his head. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Jacob had allowed. "Or maybe when the weather turns, when the freezing rain comes and the conventional rifles fail, maybe then you'll see why I built it this way." "Freezing rain's not in the forecast," Thomas had said. "Weather doesn't care about forecasts," Jacob had replied. And then, because the whiskey had loosened tongues and the night was long and cold, they'd made a bet. If freezing rain came, if conditions turned truly terrible, and if Jacob's rifle worked when the others failed, Thomas and the rest would admit they'd been wrong. They'd listen to his reasoning, learn his methods, and spread the word that sometimes junk metal was better than premium steel. "And if your rifle fails," Thomas had asked, "then I'll admit I was a fool," Jacob had said, "and I'll buy the ammunition for this whole party for the rest of the season." They'd shaken on it, and the other hunters had witnessed it, and now here Jacob stood, 2 days later, watching the freezing rain coat the world in ice, knowing that the moment of truth was coming. The clearing before him showed fresh elk sign. Not just fresh, recent. Within the last hour, a herd had moved through, 30 or 40 animals, heading for the shelter of the thick timber on the north slope. In this weather, they'd be bedded down, trying to wait out the ice storm, bunched together for warmth. It was perfect hunting conditions, or would have been, if a man could trust his rifle to fire. Jacob knew that down in the camp the other hunters would be facing a decision. They could stay put, wait out the weather, hope that tomorrow brought clearer skies and drier conditions. That was the safe choice, the sensible choice. But Jacob also knew that the storm might last 3 days or 5, and that the elk herd would move on, and that the narrow window for late-season hunting would close, and they'd all go home with less meat than their families needed. Or they could hunt in the freezing rain, trust their rifles to fire when it mattered, and take the chance that, when they needed that gun to go off, when they'd tracked an elk for hours through ice-coated forest and finally had a clear shot at 60 yards, when they pulled the trigger and felt the hammer fall, something more than a dull click would happen. Jacob didn't have to make that choice. He'd already made it. He'd made it a year ago when he started building this rifle, when he started thinking about the problem differently than everyone else. And now, as he moved into the clearing, as he began to follow the elk tracks north toward the timber, he felt no uncertainty, no doubt, just a quiet confidence in the observations that had led him here, and in the rifle on his back that everyone else thought was junk. The tracks led him through the clearing and up into the forest. The freezing rain continued, relentless, coating everything. Jacob could hear it hitting his hat, feel it bouncing off his shoulders, watch it glaze the elk tracks even as he followed them. Every exposed tree branch glistened with ice. Every fallen log wore a crystalline shell. The world was being encased, preserved, sealed in glass, and Jacob moved through it like a ghost, like something that didn't quite belong in this frozen realm, but had learned how to survive here anyway. He found the herd an hour later, bedded down in a dense stand of spruce on the north-facing slope. 43 elk, he counted, mostly cows and calves, but with 5 bulls among them, including one old warrior with antlers that spread 5 feet across. The elk were huddled together, conserving warmth, waiting for the storm to pass. They hadn't seen him yet, hadn't caught his scent. The wind was in his favor, blowing from them to him, carrying their smell of musk and wet fur and wild grass. Jacob moved into position slowly, using every bit of cover the forest offered. He was 65 yards from the nearest elk, a young bull that would provide excellent meat. A clean shot, straight on, no brush in the way, the kind of shot he'd made 1,000 times, the kind of shot that, in normal weather, would be almost routine. But this wasn't normal weather. Jacob could see the ice coating his rifle now, a thin shell of it forming over the barrel, the lock, every exposed metal surface. He could feel the cold radiating from the gun, could see his breath forming frost crystals in the air. This was the moment. This was what he'd built the rifle for, what he'd planned and calculated and tested over months of work. He brought the rifle to his shoulder, felt the familiar weight of it, the balance that he'd engineered so carefully. Through the ice-coated sights, he found the elk, placed the bead just behind the shoulder where the heart and lungs waited. His finger found the trigger, felt the resistance of the mechanism beneath its ice glaze, and before he pulled that trigger, before he tested his theory against reality, Jacob thought about the path that had led him here, about the observations and failures and moments of insight that had shown him how to build a rifle that could fire in conditions that stopped conventional guns cold. It had started, really, with that grisly incident 3 years ago. After watching 5 rifles fail, after seeing a man die because technology that should have worked simply didn't, Jacob had gone back to his cabin in the high country and taken his own rifle apart. Piece by piece, component by component, he'd examined every part, tried to understand not just how it worked, but why it worked, and more importantly, why it failed. The flintlock mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. A piece of flint held in the jaws of the hammer, striking against a steel plate to create sparks, those sparks falling into a pan of priming powder, that powder igniting and sending flame through a touch hole to ignite the main charge in the barrel. It had worked for 200 years. It was reliable, proven, trusted by hunters and soldiers across the world. But it had weaknesses. The most obvious was that the priming powder had to stay dry. Every frontiersman knew this, which was why they used cow's knees, leather covers for the lock, and why they tried to keep their rifles sheltered from rain. But in freezing rain, even a cow's knee couldn't help, because the problem wasn't just water. It was ice. Ice that formed on the frizzen, the steel plate the flint struck against. Ice that made the surface so smooth that the flint couldn't generate sparks. Ice that sealed the pan cover shut, or froze the priming powder into a useless sludge, or coated the flint itself so that when it struck the frizzen, it slid instead of sparking. Percussion cap rifles were supposed to solve this problem. Instead of loose powder in an external pan, they used a small copper cap filled with fulminate of mercury, a chemical that exploded when struck. The cap fit over a nipple, a small metal cone with a channel leading to the main charge. When the hammer fell and crushed the cap, the fulminate exploded, sending flame through the nipple and into the barrel. It was faster, more reliable, and much more weather-resistant than a flintlock. Except in freezing rain, Jacob had noticed, percussion caps had their own problems. Ice could form on the nipple, sealing it shut. Ice could coat the cap itself, cushioning the hammer blow so that it didn't hit hard enough to trigger the fulminate. And most critically, the cold itself could make the fulminate of mercury less reactive, less likely to explode with sufficient force. These were known problems. Every hunter who'd spent time in the high country in winter knew about them. The conventional solution was to keep your rifle warm, keep it dry, and avoid hunting in conditions like freezing rain. Wait for better weather. Be patient. Don't take unnecessary risks. But Jacob had started to think that maybe there was another solution. Maybe instead of trying to protect a conventional rifle from extreme conditions, you could build a rifle that actually worked better in those conditions. A rifle designed not for the gun shops of Philadelphia or St. Louis, but for the reality of November in the Montana Territory, for freezing rain and ice storms and temperatures that dropped 40 degrees overnight. The insight had come from an unlikely source, a Nez Perce medicine man named Twisted Pine, who lived 3 valleys over and who Jacob had befriended during a hard winter 5 years back. Jacob had helped the old man repair a broken travois, and in return, Twisted Pine had invited him to stay for a meal and a night of stories. During that night, the old man had shown Jacob a knife he'd made, a blade forged from 3 different types of metal laminated together. "Why 3 metals?" Jacob had asked. "Each metal has its spirit," Twisted Pine had explained through a combination of sign language and broken English that Jacob had come to understand well enough. "This one," he'd pointed to the edge, "hard, holds sharpness, but brittle, breaking cold. This one," he'd indicated the middle layer, "soft, bends, not breaks, but not hard enough for edge. This one," the back of the blade, "strong when cold gets stronger in winter. Together they are perfect. Each gives strength, takes weakness." That idea had stayed with Jacob. The concept that different materials had different properties, and that by combining them carefully, you could create something stronger than any single material alone. It was the opposite of the conventional gunsmithing wisdom that demanded uniformity, that said a rifle should be built from carefully matched materials that all responded the same way to temperature and stress. Jacob had started experimenting. He'd acquired a small forge, taught himself basic blacksmithing, and begun testing different metals and alloys. He discovered that the meteorite iron he'd found was harder than terrestrial iron, more brittle, but also more resistant to certain kinds of corrosion. He'd learned that brass didn't conduct cold as quickly as steel, which meant it stayed warmer in freezing conditions. He'd found that the copper-zinc alloy the Nez Perce used, that Indian silver, had a property that fascinated him. It became slightly more flexible in cold weather rather than more brittle, like most metals. The barrel had been the first piece he'd designed. Pure meteorite iron would have been too brittle, too prone to shattering in extreme cold. Pure terrestrial iron would have been strong, but would conduct cold too efficiently, chilling the powder charge and making ignition less reliable. So Jacob had created a blend, mixing meteoric and terrestrial iron with a small amount of nickel. The result was a barrel that was strong, resistant to the extreme temperature fluctuations of mountain weather, and with thermal properties that actually helped maintain consistent powder ignition even in cold conditions. The lock mechanism had been more challenging. Jacob had studied dozens of rifles, both flintlock and percussion cap, trying to understand what made them fail in freezing rain. The breakthrough had come when he realized that ice formation wasn't just about temperature, it was about thermal conductivity. Steel conducted heat away from itself so efficiently that in freezing rain it cooled almost instantly, causing ice to form on its surface. But brass, with its lower thermal conductivity, stayed slightly warmer, just enough to sometimes prevent ice from bonding as firmly. So Jacob had designed a hybrid lock. The hammer itself was steel for strength and impact, but the frizzen, the plate that the flint struck, was made from a brass-steel composite. The outer layer was brass, which meant that even in freezing rain, it stayed marginally warmer than pure steel. But underneath was a layer of hardened steel, which provided the hardness needed for the flint to generate sparks. The pan that held the priming powder was also brass, and he'd designed it with a slightly domed cover that caused water and ice to bead and roll off rather than pooling. The flint holder, the jaws of the hammer, he'd made from the copper-zinc alloy. This had seemed like madness to anyone who saw it. Those jaws needed to grip the flint tightly, needed to be strong and rigid. But Jacob had discovered something interesting. The alloy's property of becoming more flexible in cold weather actually created a better grip. As the temperature dropped, the metal flexed slightly, tightening around the flint rather than becoming brittle and potentially cracking. For the barrel internals, Jacob had made another unconventional choice. Traditional rifling, the spiral grooves cut into the barrel, was uniform and deep. But Jacob had designed shallower rifling with a faster twist rate. The shallower grooves meant less surface area for ice to grip if moisture somehow got inside the barrel, and the faster twist helped maintain bullet stability even if the powder charge burned slightly less efficiently in cold conditions. The stock received special attention too. Hickory was traditional, strong, and reliable. But Jacob had inlaid thin strips of bronze along the stress points and around the lock. This served two purposes. It strengthened the wood against splitting in extreme cold, and the bronze's thermal properties helped insulate the lock mechanism from the cold conducting effects of the wooden stock when it got wet. Every choice had been deliberate. Every piece of junk metal had been selected for specific properties, specific behaviors in extreme conditions. The rifle that resulted didn't look like any gun that had ever come out of a proper gunsmith's shop. It looked cobbled together, mismatched, almost jury-rigged, but it was precisely built, carefully designed, and engineered for a single purpose: to fire reliably when conventional rifles failed. Jacob had tested it extensively. He'd fired it in every kind of weather he could find or create. He'd doused it in water and let it freeze overnight, then tried to fire it. He'd coated it in ice, buried it in snow, left it out in rainstorms. And slowly, through iteration and adjustment, he'd refined the design until it worked consistently. But he'd never tested it in exactly these conditions. In freezing rain, after hours of exposure, with ice coating every surface, at the moment when a real shot mattered, when an elk stood 65 yards away and there would be no second chance. The other hunters back in camp would be checking their rifles now, trying to decide whether to venture out. They'd be looking at the ice forming on their carefully oiled locks, watching their breath freeze in the air, feeling the cold seeping through their wool and leather, and wondering if today was worth the risk. Some of them, the cautious ones like David Campbell, would stay in camp, keep their fires going, wait for better weather. But others, Jacob knew, would make the attempt. Thomas Brennan wouldn't let a little ice stop him from hunting. Neither would Samuel Worth. They'd check their rifles, cover the locks as best they could, and venture out into the storm, trusting that when the moment came, when they found an elk and lined up a shot, their rifles would fire. And maybe they would. Maybe the ice wouldn't be thick enough to prevent ignition. Maybe the cold wouldn't sap enough energy from the percussion caps to matter. Maybe luck would be with them, and everything would work just as it should. But Jacob didn't believe in maybe. He believed in planning for the worst and engineering solutions that worked even when everything else failed. He believed in observation and iteration and the willingness to abandon conventional wisdom when that wisdom no longer served. The elk in his sights hadn't moved. It stood broadside, perfect positioning, 70 yards away now. He'd miscalculated slightly. The distance was a bit farther than he'd thought. The freezing rain continued, coating everything, turning the forest into a cathedral of ice. Through his sights, Jacob could see frost forming on the elk's hide, could see the steam of its breath in the cold air. He took a breath, let it out slowly, felt his heartbeat, counted the rhythm. Between beats, in that moment of stillness, he squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell. The flint struck the frizzen, and even through the ice coating, even with the thermal challenges of the metal combinations, sparks flew. The brass pan cover flipped open, designed with a slight spring tension that forced it up even when iced, and the sparks fell into the priming powder. That powder, kept marginally drier by the brass pan's superior thermal properties, ignited with a bright flash. Flame shot through the touch hole into the main charge, and the rifle roared. Through the smoke and the ringing in his ears, Jacob saw the elk stagger. A perfect shot, right through the heart. The animal took 2 steps, its legs folded beneath it, and it was down. Dead before it hit the ground, the way a clean kill should be. No suffering, no long tracking through the ice and cold, just a good shot, made possible by a rifle that had fired exactly when it needed to. Jacob lowered the rifle slowly, and for a moment he just stood there, listening to the echoes fade across the valley, watching the other elk scatter into the timber, feeling the freezing rain continue to fall. His rifle had worked. The junk metal, the mismatched components, the unconventional design, all of it had come together exactly as he'd planned, exactly as he'd known it would. Down in the valley, 2 miles away, he knew the other hunters had heard the shot. They'd be looking up toward the ridges, wondering who had managed to fire in these conditions, wondering if it had been a lucky ignition or something else. Some of them, the ones who'd ventured out despite the weather, would be trying their own rifles now, pulling triggers on elk they'd stalked all morning, and they'd be hearing that dull click, feeling that sickening moment of failure as ice-sealed locks refused to function. Jacob made his way down to the elk. It was a young bull, maybe 4 years old, in excellent condition. It would yield 300 pounds of meat, maybe more, enough to justify the trek out into the storm, enough to prove that hunting in freezing rain wasn't impossible if you had the right equipment. As he began the work of field dressing the animal, as his knife moved through hide and muscle with the practiced efficiency of 20 years' experience, Jacob thought about the bet he'd made with Thomas Brennan. He thought about the laughter when young Peter Holland had called his rifle junk metal. He thought about the skepticism, the dismissiveness, the absolute certainty in the other hunters' minds that conventional wisdom was correct and that any deviation from it was foolishness. But he also thought about Twisted Pine's knife, about 3 metals laminated together, each contributing its own strength. He thought about the years of observation, the failures studied, the problems analyzed. He thought about how easy it would have been to simply accept that rifles failed in freezing rain, that there was nothing to be done about it, that the solution was to just wait for better weather, or accept the occasional misfire as the price of hunting in extreme conditions. The work took him an hour. By the time he'd finished quartering the elk and loading the meat into his pack, the freezing rain had slackened somewhat, though ice still coated everything. His rifle leaned against a tree nearby, frost and ice crusting its unusual surfaces, its mixed metals and composite components still ready, still functional, still capable of firing if he needed it to. Jacob was packing the last of the meat when he heard movement in the forest behind him. He turned, hand moving automatically to his knife, but relaxed when he saw Thomas Brennan emerging from the trees. The older hunter looked exhausted, his beard coated with ice, his shoulders heavy with cold, and something else, the weight of proven wrong skepticism. "I heard your shot," Thomas said quietly, 2 hours ago. "About that?" Jacob agreed. "My rifle wouldn't fire, neither would Samuel's or Marcus's. We all tried. Found elk, got good positions, pulled the triggers, and got nothing but clicks." Thomas moved closer, looking at the quartered elk, at the meat packed carefully into Jacob's frame. "I even had a bull at 40 yards, broadside, perfect shot. My rifle just clicked." Jacob said nothing. There was nothing to say that the evidence didn't speak for itself. "That gun of yours," Thomas continued, nodding toward the rifle, "the junk metal special, it fired." "It did. In this weather, with ice on every surface, after hours of exposure, it fired." "That's what I built it to do," Jacob said simply. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking at the rifle with new eyes, seeing it not as junk, but as something else entirely. Something that worked when other things failed. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "and I owe you a hearing. Back in camp tonight, I want you to explain how you built that gun. I want to understand why it works when mine doesn't." "The why is more important than the how," Jacob said. "The how is just mechanics. The why is about seeing problems differently, about not accepting that something's impossible just because it's never been done." "Then I want to understand the why," Thomas said, "and I think the others will too. Because this weather isn't unusual. This happens every year, sometimes multiple times. And we all just accepted that you couldn't hunt in freezing rain, that rifles wouldn't fire in these conditions. We accepted it because that's how it had always been. Things stay how they've always been until someone decides they should be different," Jacob said. He shouldered his pack, felt the weight of the meat settle across his back. His rifle went over his shoulder, still cold, still ice-coated, still ready. "Let's get back to camp. I'll show you what I did, and more importantly, I'll show you why." They made their way down the mountain together, through the ice-coated forest, while around them the world continued to freeze. But Jacob felt warm, or at least warmer than he had before. Not from physical heat, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he'd been right, that his observations and innovations had proven sound, that the rifle everyone had mocked was actually the only one that had worked when it mattered. That night, around the fire with all the hunters gathered close against the cold, Jacob spread his rifle across his lap and began to explain. He talked about thermal conductivity and how different metals responded to cold. He explained about the brass frizzen and the copper-zinc alloy in the hammer jaws. He showed them the meteorite iron barrel and explained how mixing metals created properties that no single metal possessed alone. But more than the mechanics, he talked about the observations that had led him to build the rifle this way. He described the grisly incident, the 5 failed rifles, the man who died. He talked about watching ice form on conventional guns, about noticing how some parts froze faster than others. He explained how he'd learned from Twisted Pine about combining materials, how he'd tested and failed and tested again until he understood not just what worked, but why it worked. Every gunsmith I've ever met, Jacob said, was taught that a rifle should be uniform, matched metals, consistent construction, everything built the same way. And in most conditions, they're right. Uniformity creates reliability, but uniformity also means that when one thing fails, everything fails the same way. If ice formation is the problem, and every part of your rifle conducts cold and attracts ice equally, then your whole rifle fails at once. But if you build with different materials, Samuel Worth said slowly, working through the logic, then each part responds differently. Some parts might ice up, but others might stay clear enough to function. Exactly, Jacob nodded. It's not about building a rifle that's perfect in ideal conditions. It's about building a rifle that's good enough in terrible conditions. And sometimes good enough, when everything else fails, is better than perfect when nothing works. Young Peter Holland, the one who'd first called the rifle junk metal, spoke up hesitantly. But how did you know it would work? How did you know all these different metals would actually function together and not just fall apart or blow up? I didn't know, Jacob admitted. Not at first. I tested. I failed. A lot. I built 3 different versions before this one, and none of them worked right. This rifle you see now, it's the result of a year of trial and error, but each failure taught me something. Each problem showed me where my understanding was wrong or incomplete. And eventually, the observations accumulated into knowledge, and knowledge became this rifle. Marcus Wright leaned forward, studying the rifle with intense interest. Could you build another one? Could you teach someone else to build them? I could, Jacob said. But more important than building another rifle exactly like this one, what I can teach is the approach, the way of thinking about problems. See, every one of you has a fine rifle. Beautiful guns built by masters worth more than this hybrid of mine would fetch at any trading post. And in most conditions, your rifles are better than mine, faster to load, more accurate at long range, prettier to look at, more reliable in normal weather. But not in freezing rain, Thomas Brennan said quietly. Not in freezing rain, Jacob agreed, because your rifles were designed for average conditions for the weather a gunsmith in Pennsylvania or St. Louis might expect. They were designed for the world as it usually is, not the world as it sometimes becomes. And out here, in the high country, the extreme cases are the ones that matter. The normal days take care of themselves. It's the terrible days, the days when everything goes wrong, that determine whether you survive. He paused, looking around the circle, at faces illuminated by firelight, seeing interest where there had been skepticism, curiosity, where there had been dismissal. What I'm saying is this: don't just accept the conventional wisdom about how things should be built or done. Observe. Watch for failures. When something doesn't work, ask yourself why, and keep asking until you understand not just the immediate cause, but the underlying principle. And then ask yourself if there's a different way, a better way, a way that takes into account the specific conditions you face instead of the general conditions everyone assumes. That's not just about rifles, David Campbell said thoughtfully. That's about everything. Cabins, tools, traps, everything we build out here. It is, Jacob agreed. It's a way of thinking. It's about matching your solutions to your actual problems, not to someone else's idea of what your problems should be. It's about being willing to look foolish, to try things that don't make sense to others, because you've observed something they haven't, or understood something they missed. The conversation continued late into the night. The hunters examined Jacob's rifle, asked questions about specific components, discussed the principles behind each design choice. Thomas Brennan, true to his word, listened carefully, and by the end of the night, he was sketching ideas for modifications to his own rifle, ways to incorporate some of Jacob's insights without completely rebuilding the gun. "I'm not going to make a copy of your rifle," Thomas said as the fire burned low, "but I am going to borrow some of your ideas, maybe a brass frizzen, maybe some of that copper zinc alloy in the hammer jaws, small changes that might make the difference when the weather turns bad." "That's the right approach," Jacob said. "Don't just copy someone else's solution. Understand the principles, then apply them to your own situation, your rifle, your conditions, your needs. What works for me might not work exactly the same for you. But the approach, the way of observing and understanding and innovating, that works for everyone." As the hunters turned in for the night, as the fire collapsed into embers and the freezing rain finally stopped, Jacob sat alone for a few minutes, his strange rifle across his knees. He thought about the long path that had led to this moment, about the grizzly attack that could have killed him, about Twisted Pine's knife and its lesson, about combining different strengths, about the year of failed experiments and gradual understanding. He thought about how easy it would have been to just accept that rifles failed in freezing rain, that this was a limitation of the technology, something to work around rather than something to solve. He thought about how the conventional wisdom had been so certain, so absolute in its insistence, that a rifle should be built one way, the proper way, the traditional way. And he thought about how the difference between life and death, between success and failure, between meat for the winter and an empty larder, sometimes came down to being willing to think differently, to observe carefully, to innovate boldly, and to trust your own understanding, even when everyone else thought you were a fool. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of brilliant blue sky day that made you forget the previous day's ice storm. The hunters packed up their camp, and 3 of them, Thomas, Samuel, and Marcus, decided to stay on for another day to try their luck now that the weather had cleared. The others headed down the mountain toward their scattered homesteads and settlements, carrying news of Jacob's strange rifle and its success in impossible conditions. Over the following weeks and months that news spread. Trappers and hunters throughout the Montana Territory heard about the junk metal rifle that fired in freezing rain. Some dismissed it as exaggeration or luck, but others, especially those who'd experienced the frustration of a failed rifle in critical moments, sought Jacob out. They wanted to see the rifle, understand its principles, learn its secrets. Jacob shared what he'd learned freely. He explained the thermal properties of different metals, demonstrated how brass resisted ice formation better than steel, showed them the copper-zinc alloy and where to find or trade for it. He didn't try to sell rifles or keep his innovations secret. He taught, explained, helped others understand not just his specific solutions, but the broader approach of observing problems, understanding principles, and innovating based on actual conditions rather than conventional wisdom. Not everyone was convinced. There were gunsmiths who insisted that mixing metals was dangerous and foolish, that Jacob had simply been lucky, that one success didn't prove a principle. There were hunters who continued to trust their conventional rifles and managed well enough by simply avoiding hunting in extreme weather. And there were those who tried to copy Jacob's design but didn't understand the principles behind it, who ended up with rifles that were genuinely poorly made rather than deliberately unconventional. But there were also those who grasped what Jacob was really teaching, who understood that the rifle was just an example, a specific case study in a broader approach to problem-solving and innovation. These hunters, trappers, and frontier craftsmen began applying similar thinking to other challenges. They designed cold-weather clothing that combined different materials for different properties. They built cabins that used multiple insulation strategies rather than single uniform approaches. They created tools that mixed metals and materials in ways that traditional craftsmen would have considered wrong, but that worked better in extreme conditions. Within 5 years, hybrid rifles similar to Jacob's design were relatively common in the high country. Within 10 years, some of the innovations he'd pioneered, particularly the brass frizens and copper zinc hammerjaws, were being incorporated into conventional rifles by established gunsmiths. They didn't call them innovations, they called them mountain adaptations or high country modifications, but they were acknowledgments, even if unspoken, that the junk metal rifle had been right, that conventional wisdom had its limits, and that sometimes the man everyone mocked knew something everyone else had missed. Jacob himself continued to hunt and trap in the Montana Territory for another 23 years. His rifle, maintained carefully, but used hard, fired reliably through countless freezing rains, ice storms, and extreme cold snaps. He built 3 more rifles over those years, each one an evolution of the original design, each incorporating new observations and refinements. He taught anyone who asked and freely shared his knowledge with those who were willing to listen and learn. In the spring of 1865, at the age of 60, Jacob Hartley was caught in an unseasonable snowstorm while checking his trap lines. He managed to build a shelter and wait out the worst of the storm, but the exposure and cold had weakened him. When Thomas Brennan found him 2 days later, Thomas, who had learned from Jacob all those years ago and who had remained a friend ever since, Jacob was barely conscious. They got him down the mountain to the settlement, but pneumonia had set in, and he died 3 days later, surrounded by friends and fellow hunters who had learned from his innovations. His strange rifle, the one everyone had laughed at back in 1842, was buried with him. It seemed fitting. The rifle had been built for a specific purpose, for a specific set of conditions, and it had fulfilled that purpose perfectly for 23 years. It deserved to rest with the man who had envisioned it, built it, and proved that sometimes the mocked and misunderstood approach is actually the right one. But the knowledge that rifle represented, the approach to problem-solving and innovation it embodied, didn't die with Jacob. It lived on in the hunters he'd taught, the craftsmen he'd influenced, the frontier engineers who had learned that conventional wisdom was a starting point, not a destination. It lived on in every hybrid rifle that fired reliably in freezing rain, in every tool that combined materials in unconventional ways, in every solution that worked not because it followed tradition, but because it addressed the actual problem. The story of the junk metal rifle became one of those frontier legends, told and retold around campfires and in trading posts. Like most legends, it grew in the telling. Some versions had Jacob building the rifle in a single inspired night. Others had him surviving impossible conditions that would have killed a dozen men. A few had him shooting grizzlies at 500 yards in blizzards. But the core truth remained, passed down through generations of mountain men and frontier families. The truth that sometimes the wisdom of the crowd is wrong, that sometimes the mocked and dismissed approach is the correct one, that sometimes survival depends on your willingness to observe, understand, and innovate rather than simply follow tradition. The real lesson of Jacob Hartley's rifle wasn't about metalwork or gunsmithing. It wasn't even really about rifles at all. It was about the approach to problems that he exemplified, the willingness to question conventional wisdom when that wisdom stopped serving its purpose. It was about observing failures and learning from them rather than just accepting them as inevitable. It was about understanding that different conditions require different solutions, and that sometimes the solution that looks wrong to everyone else is exactly right for your specific situation. In the end, Jacob's innovation was simple. He paid attention. He watched how rifles failed in freezing rain and asked himself, why? He studied different materials and observed their properties in extreme conditions. He learned from people whose knowledge came from different traditions than his own. He tested, failed, adjusted, and tested again until he understood not just what worked, but why it worked and when it worked. And then he built something that embodied that understanding, something that everyone else called junk, but that proved itself when everything else failed. That's the wisdom that the frontier demands, and that Jacob Hartley's rifle represents. Not any specific technique or design, but the approach itself. the willingness to look at a problem from a fresh perspective, the courage to try solutions that make others laugh, the patience to observe, test, fail, and learn, the humility to seek knowledge from unexpected sources, and the confidence to trust your own understanding even when conventional wisdom says you're wrong. Out on the frontier, where conditions were extreme and unforgiving, where the difference between success and failure could mean the difference between life and death. That approach wasn't just valuable, it was essential. It was the difference between the settlers who barely survived and those who thrived. It was what separated the rigid traditionalists who died when their methods failed from the adaptive innovators who lived because they'd prepared for failure. Jacob understood this. He lived it, and in his strange, hybrid junk metal rifle, he created a physical embodiment of that philosophy, a tool that worked when conventional tools failed because it was built for the real world instead of the theoretical one, for actual conditions instead of assumed ones, for survival instead of tradition. The hunters who laughed at that rifle learned their lesson in the freezing rain that November morning in 1842. They learned that sometimes the fool is the wise man, and the wise men are fools. They learned that judgment based on appearance or convention can blind you to genuine innovation. They learned that mockery is easy, but understanding is hard, and that the hard path is usually the right one. And most importantly, they learned to pay attention to the quiet innovators, the ones who observe carefully and think deeply, and build things that look wrong but work right. Because those are the people who see problems others miss, who find solutions others overlook, who survive when conventional wisdom fails. The junk metal rifle fired true in the freezing rain, not because it was lucky, not because it was magic, but because it was built by a man who understood that survival demanded innovation, that innovation required observation, and that observation meant being willing to see the world as it actually was rather than as tradition said it should be. And that's a lesson worth remembering, worth teaching, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges lie ahead. Because the world is still full of freezing rain, still full of moments when conventional solutions fail and unconventional ones succeed. And it's still full of people who will laugh at the junk metal solutions until those solutions work, until the moment of truth comes and only the strange, hybrid, thoughtfully designed tools prove reliable. Jacob Hartley knew this. He lived it. And his rifle, for all the years it served him faithfully, was never really about metal and wood and powder. It was about approach and attitude and the willingness to trust careful observation over inherited assumption. It was about the frontier spirit, not just of geographic expansion, but of intellectual exploration, the willingness to venture into unknown territory and return with knowledge that everyone needs but few are willing to seek. That's the real story of the hunters who laughed at the junk metal rifle. Not that they were wrong and Jacob was right, though that's certainly true, but that they learned to look deeper, to question more carefully, to observe more closely. That they learned, as every generation must learn, that wisdom comes from experience and observation rather than from tradition and assumption. That sometimes the path forward requires leaving the well-worn trail and striking out into unknown territory, trusting not in what others have always done, but in what you yourself have carefully observed and thoughtfully understood. And when the freezing rain comes, when conditions turn impossible and conventional solutions fail, that's the wisdom that saves lives, that ensures survival, that transforms the frontier from a place of mere subsistence into a place where humans cannot just survive, but thrive. That's the legacy of the junk metal rifle and of the quiet craftsman who built it, and of all those who learned from his example that sometimes the laughingstock is the wisest man in camp, if only you have eyes to see and ears to hear, and the humility to learn from those you first dismissed.